Let's get started. Good day, class. We'll start our discussion with Chapter 1, Thinking Critically with Psychological Science. First, psychology is a science. It employs an empirical approach. Underlying all science is a passion to explore and to understand without misleading or being misled. So that is one of our key goals. Now, part of this science is to require a scientific attitude of curiosity, skepticism, and humility. Curiosity. We want to know things. We need to find answers to things. And that's going to be a key ingredient to the attitude that helps psychologists and other research scientists to try to learn more about the truth around us. We have skepticism. When something is presented to us, we do not always accept it at face value. Someone tells us something, we are going to be somewhat skeptical about that information until we can validate it in some way. And humility. Science is about asking questions, trying to find out if your ideas and notions are true or not. But part of that process is oftentimes being wrong. And when we talk about humility, that means that we're okay with being wrong. We don't like it necessarily, but we know that is the process of learning the truth. So we want to have humility. We're not always right. So it requires a scientific attitude to implement science, one of curiosity, one of skepticism, and one of humility. So this empirical approach, which we'll see more about in this chapter and future chapters to come, is an evidence-based method that draws on observation and experimentation. A couple of questions that we always want to think about. How does the scientific attitude support scientific inquiry? How does it support our thinking in everyday life? One of the goals of psychology in any general psychology course is to make you a better consumer of information in your entire life. Not about just knowing knowledge about psychology, but knowing how to look at arguments that are being presented to you in a very critical manner to improve your ability to analyze more properly. That's also another goal of this particular class. So, critical thinking, key ingredient. Critical thinking does not blindly accept arguments and conclusions that are given to us. What we do is we examine assumptions, appraise the sources, discern or determine possible hidden biases, evaluate evidence, and assess our conclusions. So, examining assumptions. We always have some sort of assumptions, but we don't always have the correct assumptions. We may hold assumptions which are not accurate or not truthful. So part of the process of being a critical thinker is to find out what your assumptions are and then put them to the test to make sure that your assumptions are not leading you astray. We also want to appraise the sources. When someone tells you something, you ask them a variety of questions. You ask them, where'd you hear that? Where'd you learn that? Who told you that? That is us appraising the source of information, because not all sources are going to be treated equally. Because some of those sources may have what we see as the next bullet, hidden biases. You want to determine if somebody who's trying to convince you of something has an ulterior motive, a hidden bias for you to buy into it. So that if you buy into it, maybe they get something out of it. So we want to discern what potential hidden biases are there. And then we want to evaluate the evidence. Someone offers evidence to you, you need to evaluate it very critically to make sure it is accurate and it makes sense. And then once we have conclusions offered to us, we want to assess those conclusions. Do those conclusions make sense based on the evidence offered? Based on potential biases that may exist? Based on us appraising the sources and based on us having examined our particular assumptions? So we now know what the scientific attitude are, what the scientific attitude is. We also know what critical thinking and how valuable that is to us as individuals and as participants in the field of psychology. Now let's look a little bit at the history of psychology. Psychological science is born. First, it should be noted that psychological ideas have existed for a very, very long time. Philosophers asked loads of questions that were very psychological in nature. But before all that, we have philosophy. Before that, philosophy was just asking questions. It wasn't until psychology came about to try to answer some of these questions, not just asking them, but finding out a way to answer them. So, psychology's first laboratory was established by Wilhelm Wundt in 1879. So, office space, lab space was set aside by the university, Leipzig University. Money and resources were provided for the very first time for psychology exclusively. And so this date is sort of suggested as the first date of psychology as an academic discipline, as a scientific endeavor, because all of this commitment was provided for it to study psychology. So what Wundt sought to measure, he referred to as the atoms of the mind. Psychology's first school of thought, however, is considered to be structuralism. Now, Titchener was a student of Wundt. It should be noted that many of the great names in psychology studied with Wundt. All of a sudden, we had this place in Germany where this individual had established this psychological laboratory, and everyone around the globe who had some interest in this area of psychology, they found their way to him, and they studied with him and studied under him. Titchener was one of his students. Titchener is associated with the school of thought called structuralism. And basically what a school of thought is this. When a group of individuals have a shared belief about something, for example, a shared belief as to what is important to study in psychology and how do we study psychology. When those things sort of become more clustered around each other and are shared by a group of people, we consider to have it as a school of thought. And the first school of thought is structuralism. They employed a technique called introspection, where people would experience stimuli in the environment and they would describe their conscious experience of that. The notion was for them to develop a key idea as to the structure of the mind by doing that. Now, there were several schools of thought early in psychology. Structuralism was one of the first. Then we have William James. He was the American who went over to study with Wundt, and his version of psychology was slightly different. He was not interested in the structure of the mind. He was more interested in what psychology does to us. What does it do for us? Okay, and so the notion here is that psychology has a function. And in William James's mind, who was greatly influenced by Charles Darwin, who came up with the theories of evolution and natural selection, he was very focused on the idea that psychology aids us in functioning. It's a way of adapting, very key and very similar to the idea that we saw offered by Charles Darwin and natural selection. So James saw psychology as a function, helping us to survive and to prosper. A couple of other things in the early days of psychology. It should be noted in the early days of psychology, it was generally very non-diverse. Basically, we're talking about white males. White males were the main population of the early days of psychology. And we saw there were several women who would go through the schools, who were allowed to go to school or at least attend classes at the doctoral level. But oftentimes, even if They went through everything their male counterparts went through. Even if they passed everything they needed to pass, they were not offered a degree because many schools at the time did not give females degrees. All right. Whitney Calkins, a pioneering memory researcher, was the first female APA, American Psychological Association president. Floyd Washburn, the first female PhD. So we see that it took some time for psychology to become a more diverse field. And diversity is very important because when you have more diversity in a particular field, you get a more expansive list of ideas from different sources and approach problems in different ways, which can be very, very advantageous. So, do today's psychological science embrace diversity? Yes. We see it much more these days where some fields in psychology are predominantly held by females. So psychology has spread around the globe. And there's several areas of psychology that do point to a great deal more diversity, particularly compared to the early days of psychology as a science. Now, we talked about the schools of thought just a minute ago. Now we're going to talk about what happens when psychological science matured somewhat. So there's this thing called major forces. Major forces are like school of thought on steroids. That there were such powerful forces in the psychological arena that they sort of like dwarfed everything else. And these were the major forces. From the 1920s to the 1960s, it was about behaviorism in America. Introspection and psychology now viewed as scientific study. Behavior scientifically defined, conditioned, observed, and measured. So the key thing here is that behaviorism, what they were basically communicating was, for psychology to be a science and for psychology to fully mature, we need to have a behavioristic approach, meaning that we need to be able to observe and measure things. We need to have something that's concrete. And that was one of the benefits of the behaviorist movement, the major force of behaviorism. Introspection in psychology, now viewed as scientific study, but introspection by the behaviorists was deemed nothing that should be noteworthy in a field that tried to be very scientific. One of the key things during this time frame in the early days of psychology was John Watson and Rayner, his graduate student. They championed scientific study of behavior. And you may have heard of the Little Albert study before. And we'll talk more about Little Albert later in the course. But Little Albert was an infant that they were able to condition to have fear. And one of the key things about this is that they were able to demonstrate that having fear can be a learned behavior. We taught Little Albert to be afraid of something that he was not previously afraid of. And we'll talk about the details about Little Albert a little bit later. Now, so behaviorism was a major force. It really took over the landscape, in America at least, to a large extent. But other major forces also existed. So we had the Freudian psychoanalytic psychology also, where we emphasized ways that the unconscious mind and childhood experiences affect behavior. So the notion here is that when you have issues as an adult, according to the Freudian perspective, that it could be something that relates to your childhood. It could be something that relates to unconscious conflicts that were never fully resolved. And we'll talk more about Freud a little bit later as well. And then there's Skinner, B.F. Skinner, a personality theorist and therapist who was a major champion of the behaviorist movement. These were some significant major forces. Now, let me give you a little bit of a summary as to the major forces here that we've talked about so far. So we have the behaviorist movement, was all about behavior, things that people could observe objectively and measure and quantify. Then we have the Freudians, saying basically our behavior today as an adult is going to be based on things that we're not even aware of coming from our unconscious, or things that we barely remember from our childhood. Both these forces in psychology painted a very stark picture, according to some. They thought that Freudian psychology took a lot of self control and self determination away from humans, from people. And when the behaviorists started to become very, very strong, they would make certain statements, for example, that they could condition anybody to be afraid of anything, that they could control the consequences of behavior, they could control the people, and therefore taking the ability of self-determination and self-control again away from us humans. Well, there was one group who hated that idea, and that group was the humanists. Okay, the humanists. And humanistic psychology found behaviorism and Freudian psychology to be too limiting. And so what the humanistic psychology did is they emphasized human growth potential. So they were taking the exact opposite tack that the Freudians and the behaviorists were taking during this time frame. This became a major force in the 1960s. And what I want to emphasize here is this. Humanistic psychology was a reaction to the other two major movements and forces in psychology at the time: behaviorism and Freudian psychology. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow are some of the founders of this particular view of psychology, humanistic psychology. They focus on the need for love, acceptance, and the environment that nurtures or limits personal growth. So basically what it comes down to is they opened up a lot of possibilities. So Freudian was all about the unconscious. The behaviorists were all about only about overt behaviors. They really didn't care that much about mental processes. And so when we see this next force in psychology appear in the 1960s, they open the door back up to mental processes, things that we cannot exactly see, things that may exist inside the human. And as we'll see a little bit later, that becomes a major thing, a major powerful thing in psychology to be able to do that, to start thinking about mental processes again. So let's talk real quickly here about contemporary psychology. So we've talked a little bit about the history, the start of psychology as a science, the development of the early schools of thought, the major forces and movements in the 20s and 60s. Now, in contemporary psychology, we have the cognitive revolution begins in the 1960s as well. So around the same time that we have the humanistic movement gaining strength, we saw the cognitive revolution start up again. So psychology, the science of behavior and mental processes, roots in many disciplines and countries, growing and globalizing. Psychology started to spread all over the place. Cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes, such as those that occur when we perceive, learn, remember, think, communicate, and solve problems. Cognitive neuroscience is an interdisciplinary study of the brain activity linked with thinking, including perception, memory, and language. Now, let's note a couple of other things too that were going on at this same time. So during this time frame, we not only have humanism going on, humanistic psychology, bringing light to more thinking things again, we also have the development of certain types of technologies where we can image the brain more properly and see what's going on inside the brain while we're doing processing information or doing math problems. So all this stuff sort of came together and helped to boost psychology at the same time. We also have evolutionary psychology, the study of the evolution of behavior in the mind using natural selection principles. We have nature-nurture issue, which I'm sure you've heard of before. The nature-nurture question and debate has gone on for many, many decades now. It comes down to this. Are the traits that you possess, the characteristics that you have now as an adult, are traits and these characteristics present at birth, or do we develop them through experience? That's the key idea. Are we born with who we're going to be, or do we develop who we're going to be as we gain experience? Now, we mentioned Darwin earlier as a great influence on William James, who sort of founded the area of functionalism. Well, Darwin came up with natural selection. Basically, inherited traits that better enable survival and reproduction are most likely to be passed on to the next generation. The basic idea is this about natural selection. Let's talk about giraffes. One of the key characteristics of giraffes are their very, very long necks. They need those long necks oftentimes to be able to reach food. At some point or another, there were probably giraffes out there who had rather short, stumpy necks. The problem, however, was this. If the environment changed and all the food for these growing giraffes was too high, then it's possible that those giraffes just died off. Short-necked giraffes would die off because they didn't get enough food to live long enough to have other short-necked giraffe babies, so to speak. That's what natural selection is. That you cannot survive the environment because you don't have the characteristics to do so. And those characteristics are selected by nature in a sense, so that only the long-necked giraffes survive. We also have behavior genetics, the study of relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. So contemporary psychology, to a large extent, covers a whole vast area of things that are of interest to humans and our situation. In psychology, we still have a lot of different subdisciplines, a lot. One of the reasons that our subdisciplines are still considered to be psychology is because we never let them go. Let me explain a little bit. If you've ever been in a sociology class and then taken an anthropology class and then maybe taken a criminal justice class, believe it or not, sociology, anthropology, criminal justice, they're all part of the same big umbrella, which was sociology. But somewhere in the past, sociology let their discipline sort of go away to a large extent. Psychology never did, so we maintain a lot more control over them. So, we see nature and nurture. So this debate of nature versus nurture, which I'm sure you've heard of before, is a big one. So nurture works on what nature endows. Nurture works on what nature endows. Our species, human beings, is biologically endowed with enormous capacity to learn and adapt. Every psychological event, every thought, every emotion is simultaneously a biological event as well. So what it comes down to is this. Nurture works on what nature endows. We are going to be somewhat constrained by our physical capabilities, nature, what we were born with. What we learn and what we experience may heighten certain skill sets and abilities, but only up to a certain degree. So nature-nurture is still an important debate, but we cannot have nurture overcome natural nature deficiencies. So another area of contemporary psychology is cross-cultural and gender psychology. A culture is sort of a shared ideas and behaviors passed from one generation to the next. All right? Even when specific attitudes and behaviors vary by gender or across cultures, as they often do, the underlying processes are much the same. What does a culture do? A culture shapes behavior in a wide variety of ways. Why do we want to study culture? We study culture to help us discern the similarities and differences. Why do we study gender differences? It helps prevent conflicts and misunderstanding in daily interactions. We have to note that we do have differences. There are cultural differences. There are other biological differences between people. These differences are not bad, but they do exist. Now, our particular culture, I'm going to assume that most people listening to me have been influenced by some degree with a westernized type of culture. We have weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic culture. That's a thing. Basically meaning that we will see the world in specific ways because the culture teaches us. It helps to mold and to shape us. So, in order to understand an individual, oftentimes we have to understand the culture that helped to raise them. When it comes to gender, gender socially and biologically defined. Gender, gender identity, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to chapter 5. We'll have whole conversations about that. So the idea is, when it comes to contemporary psychology, it is a whole wide variety of things out there. And we have the following. Positive psychology. Positive psychology centers on happiness as a byproduct of a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. Pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. It uses scientific methods to support development of a good life. Seligman and others focus research on human flourishing. How it is that we can grow and become the best version of ourselves that we possibly could become. So as I keep painting this picture, it's more and more obvious, hopefully to you, that psychology is a wide, vast area that focuses on just about every single aspect of the human condition. Now, as we wrap up the idea about contemporary psychology, I want to focus on a couple of things real quickly here. First, we want to talk about the three main levels of analysis. Anytime we go through our chapters, we'll see this pop up from time to time. Anything that we most likely have the ability to discuss in this course can be looked at from three primary levels. It can be analyzed by the biological factors that influence it, the psychological factors that influence it, and the social cultural factors that influence that particular phenomenon that we have of interest at that moment. In addition, we also want to talk about a variety of other perspectives of psychology out there. The table 1.1 in your textbook, and I have it illustrated here as well, we see a perspective of psychology, a focus, the types of questions they ask, and examples of subfields using this particular perspective. So get familiar with table 1.1 in your textbook. We have neuroscience, evolutionary, behavior genetics, psychodynamic, behavioral perspective, cognitive, social, cultural, and so on. Now, let's get back real quickly to this thing that I started off with. There's three main levels of analysis: the biological, psychological, and social, cultural. Here, we talk about it as the biopsychosocial. The levels of analysis that we always can look at: biopsychosocial, biological, psychological, social, cultural. So let's look at a behavior or a mental process. Basically, what this communicates is that any behavior or mental process will be influenced by biological factors, genetic predispositions, genetic mutations, natural selection, and so on. Or psychological influences, learned fears or other learned expectations, emotional responses, cognitive processing and perceptual interpretations. Or social cultural influences, the presence of others, cultural or societal or family expectations, peer and other group influences, and compelling models such as in the media. So all these factors, the biological, the psychological, and the social cultural factors, influence us. They influence our behaviors and they influence our mental processes. And as we go through the future chapters of this course, we'll be teasing some of these things apart as well. Now, to really show you the variety of different types of careers that we have, let's talk about another aspect of contemporary psychology. We have two key areas. When we look at research in psychology, the two types of research out there are basic research and applied research. Basic research is pure science that aims to just increase the scientific knowledge base. Somebody is studying something simply because they want to figure out how it works. They have no idea whatsoever if it can ever be used for anything or applied in any way. They just want to see how it works. Applied research is different. Applied research is scientific study that aims to solve practical problems. So when we look at applied research, they already have a certain destination in mind. They're doing research for a specific purpose, to solve a particular problem, to come up with a specific solution to something. Now, professionally, there are a variety of different types of psychologists out there. A few that we want to cover real quickly here. We have counseling psychologists, a branch of psychology that assists people with problems in living, often related to school, work, or marriage, and in achieving greater well-being. We have clinical psychologists, a branch of psychology that studies, assesses, and treats people with psychological disorders. We have psychiatry, a branch of medicine dealing with psychological disorders, practiced by physicians who sometimes provide medical, for example, a drug, treatment, as well as psychological therapy. And then community psychologists, a branch of psychology that studies how people interact with their social environment and how social institutions can affect individuals and groups. We'll stop there for now.